Hello.
Hello, Tracy.
Hi, how are you guys?
Doing very, very well. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Very nice space. I think that gets at least a 9 out of 10 on Room Rater. So you're doing well so far. Um,
Likewise.
so it is my absolute privilege to introduce a friend of mine from back home, Tracy Giesz-Ramsay. So Tracy Giesz-Ramsay is a journalist and photographer based in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. She is currently a featured columnist with Ricochet Media, which is a multi-platform independent news site in Canada. She's reported on Vancouver's drug crisis since 2016, focusing on the neuroscience of addiction and the policies surrounding substance use in Canada. Tracy's writing has appeared in Nouveau Magazine, Monte Cristo Magazine, The National Observer, Vancouver Observer, Ricochet Media, This Magazine, Megaphone Magazine, iPolitics, Rosewood Conversations, among other outlets. And I write here that she's a friend of mine from high school. That's probably a little bit generous to myself. She was much more popular than I was back in high school, but
This is not true.
I'm giving myself a few notches up here. So Tracy, thanks so much for joining us. I am so thrilled we were able to read your 2018 piece in Ricochet, The Underlying Cause of an Escalating Crisis. So a terrific example of what we might call shoe leather journalism. Spent time reporting from Vancouver. You spent time reporting from Manhattan. You want to walk us through a process of just putting together that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it takes interest. So, being a freelance journalist, you're lucky if you find something that you can write about that you really enjoy or find fascinating. So yeah, interest, of course, just reading about it. So I started reading. I mean, up here we have a renowned doctor, Dr. Gabor Mate. He has written from. He was a GP, so an MD. He wrote about addiction. He was on the downtown east side, which is one of the highest concentrated areas of drug use in North America. So I've attended a number of talks by him, and we also have Dr. Mark Lewis out of Toronto. He's in the Netherlands, I believe, and he talked a lot about the conditioning of behavior and yeah, just found it fascinating, and then reached out for interviews. So the process always starts with asking people if they'd like to speak and explain it to you, and then you kind of gather, what they say and put it together. And we have another at University of British Columbia where Dr. Mohammed went. We have Bruce Alexander, so he did a lot of the early rat experiments. So looking at how rats will touch a lever to get heroin, but if they're in a larger environment with other rats and activities and food and mates to cuddle with and all of that, they actually don't press those levers as much. But so at UBC, you speak to him, and you just kind of you gather kind of everything everybody's saying, and then of course the harder part is to reach out to other individuals who've experienced addiction. So often people, especially with subject matter like this, they might want their names to be withheld, or or they've gotten over it and they want to speak about it and say, hey, this is my experience, and this is what I did, what I learned. And yeah, and then you kind of just piece together. There's a lot of transcribing. So you interview them, write it down, and then piece the quotes together and go from there. Yeah.
So around how long was the total time span between when you started to research the story and when it actually got published?
Yeah. So being freelance too, I mean, I'm a columnist now with Ricochet, but when I published this, it was freelance. It's hard to find editors who are interested in publishing a longer piece, because on the internet, as I'm sure all of you know, it's quick to get distracted halfway through and you want to click onto other things. And so it's hard to find an editor, especially with kind of a beat that is, it's a harder one for people to read. It's not some investigative report on, some corruption in Malta or something like that, which is more fun. But once you find your editor, you kind of, you can take your notes. And this particular piece, which thank you all for reading if you have, took 4 years actually of my life. So there are a lot of people I interviewed who got cut because of, you have word length, you have have to fit it into something. You don't want to go on and on unless you're writing a book, especially for online journalism. But other pieces that I write for this column, they'll between 1,500 and 2,000 words, so it's not as time consuming. Usually it's 1 or 2 interviews as opposed to 6 or 7 or 10 or sometimes 20.
Yeah, it must have been hugely rewarding on your end to see the end result.
Absolutely. Oh, I cannot tell you. Yeah, any journalist will tell you if they've done all those interviews. And of course it's hard when you do chat with someone and their piece doesn't get into the piece. Fortunately with this one that you guys read, that didn't happen. So yeah, it's very, very rewarding. Yeah.
So I remember you and I met for coffee maybe in 2017, and even then you were talking about childhood trauma. And
Mhm.
Dr. Mate has such an interesting story with his own unique childhood trauma, being a child during the Holocaust. And I
Uh-huh.
like how you boil it down to 3 tiers of addiction. So you talk about conditioning.
Yes.
I think that's how most of us will think about the actual habit formation and the habit fulfillment. But you move on to tiers 2 and 3 that we think about
Mhm.
less, and I would argue policies are less good at dealing with, being early trauma and, of course, socioeconomic exclusion. I
Mhm.
think the article does an especially good job with early trauma. You want to talk me through how you identify that and sort of how early trauma informs your piece?
Yeah, of course. Interestingly enough, Dr. Gabor-Mate he's big in Vancouver right now. His work, as well as Maya Salovitz, who's mentioned in the piece, she her first book. She's based in Manhattan. Her first book was about a boy who was raised as a dog. So that really impacted me. The thing about that is that it was never talked about before, and now it's getting a lot more exposure. But it is so powerful because we know that in those, I mean, if any of you taken psychology 101, you know this, but the early environment, humans are born premature, so we are actually more susceptible to our environment, so the stimuli around us. If you have a loving mother, she looks you in the eye, she holds you, she touches you, she smiles at you, you develop the ability to produce those, your reward system is becoming more robust, so you produce the ability to release endorphins on your own much better than if you weren't in that environment. Say your mom, and again, it's not to fault any parents because it's hard to be a parent, but say your parents are overworked and they're overtaxed and you're crying, so they shove you in a closet. Is that their fault? It's not their fault, but it is depriving that child of the stimulation required for those, for the kind of the neurotransmitters to be produced and to be firing. So Canadian psychologist Donald Hebb, he said cells that fire together wire together. So the more that I'm sure you all know, the more that you get that from your external environment. So with drug addiction, it's particularly interesting because when you don't have that, and you didn't have that, provided to you when you were young, or you didn't find that in your schoolmates when you were younger too, which the brain's plastic, it's neuroplasticity. You can get it from other parts. It is harder. You have to have more of it than if you had it early. But when you do get that, there's morphine is the same as our endogenous opioid called endorphins. So morphine hooks onto the receptors it attaches to the receptors for our endogenous morphine. And what that does is it soothes the body, it relaxes you of pain and stress. And as we know, if you're in an abusive childhood, upbringing, you have heightened cortisol, heightened adrenaline, all of that. So what drugs actually do is people always say, I mean, well, Gabor actually, he always says, don't ask why the drug use, ask why the pain. So, if you're using drugs and it soothes you and it gives you those endorphins, or it, releases or relaxes the production of cortisol and adrenaline, of course, how do you ask those people to stop? Because they feel so good and they didn't feel this way. So it's a particularly sad one. But you see it a lot in people when you talk to them about addiction. Not everybody wants to talk about that, but when they do, it's powerful.
I'm glad that you brought up pain. So I'm teaching this course from Kentucky. About half of my students are Kentucky. I
Okay.
just finished my first lecture. About 20 minutes of it was a screed against Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. sorry, group, you're going to have to deal with that. But there's this conversation we have around prescription painkillers,
Yeah.
things like OxyContin, and we tend to focus on the physical dimensions of
Yes.
pain. Why do we ignore emotional pain?
Yeah.
That plays much the same role in sort of the level of our brains.
Hmm. Absolutely. So there's a lot of research that kind of shows that physical pain, emotional pain piggybacks on the same pain centers as physical pain. So again, that is, when you look at that, there are a lot of people kind of talking about Maya Salovitz and Dr. Terry Lewis. They're both great on Twitter for all of looking at that exact, question and saying, why are, especially when you kind of say, okay, let's end prescribing and let's pretend that, this, well, not pretend, but let's say that this isn't effective. What they're doing is they're not looking at, okay, maybe someone who they broke their leg but they continue use, maybe that person is in emotional pain, or especially in, I mean, you look at a lot of places in America that have been completely gutted for work and for, this kind of moves on to the economic exclusion factor, is that high stress, that worry, that fear, that, it's traumatic for a lot of people when they lose their work and they can't pay for their families. Maybe they did get a prescription for, a dental surgery or whatever it was, but they felt so good using it that it reduced their emotional pain, their fear, their anxiety. So when you say, okay, let's, end prescribing, it's not addressing, of course, if we look at the cue routine reward, the kind of the conditioning of it all, that'll stop that in its tracks, right? But what are they going to do to address that pain if there's no other option, right? So
So you kind of talk about these two dueling discourses that we have around drug addiction in North America. They're both individualized, and I think you argue in your article that they both miss the point. So there's discourse one. Look, drug addiction is a lack of willpower. I'm
mhm,
34 years old. I've managed to avoid it. You should be able to too if you just
yeah,
had more willpower. That's discourse one. Discourse two, which is somewhat more evolved, is also quite individualized. And look, certain people are going to have genetic and family risk factors that are going to make them more susceptible to drug addiction.
yeah.
So, in your view, do both of these discourses kind of miss the point?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's fun. Sally Satel, she's an incredible writer on addiction as well. She says the same thing. I interviewed Dr. Carl Hart. He's got a book. He's doing the media rounds right now. If you guys want to listen to an interview with him, he's easy to Google. But he's saying, you know, I asked him. I said, but what about this genetic component? There's got to be something there, right? We see, within intergenerational addiction, you have a parent, a grandparent, and a father who's, they drink or they overuse alcohol. He was quite frank, and he looked at me and he goes, I've looked. He's a neuroscientist at Columbia in New York. Because I've looked for the gene to cause addiction, it's not there. And he goes, it's a stupid argument for stupid people. So he's quite frank about it. I didn't include that in the piece, but there hasn't been that much to say that it's Maya Salovitz will say that there's a lot of inheritable traits. So if you're more sensitive, um, maybe being, we look at COVID, maybe being isolated from your peers affects you a bit more. So the inheritable traits of being a little bit more sensitive, or you experience things heavier or deeper than other people. So those are some genes that you can maybe say add to addiction. But I mean, if you're looking for one gene, it's not there. And then of course the willpower argument is just, it's tired. I mean, you look at all the science, and between everything that we know about how the brain works and how we're wired for learning, which is part of that conditioning, the more you repeat something, the more propensity dopamine, which is that motivating chemical that kind of drives you towards obtaining the whether it's highly palatable food or whether it's heroin or whether it's alcohol, it's that driving chemical. So there's a lot of sense to say that you can't really stop someone in the tracks just by saying, where's the prefrontal cortex, why isn't it coming online, and saying, hey, stop, don't do that, we don't want to do that. It's overridden by those more primal kind of emotionally driven reward centers of the brain. So those two arguments, I understand where they came from, but they've kind of been proven to not be hold much weight.
So what's interesting is you and I have talked about this a little bit, kind of through Twitter and sort of various email exchanges. You shared an article with me a few months ago about the CADS program that's being taken. That's kind of a pilot program in Indiana. So the Court Addiction and Drug Services program. So we're actually on Friday. You're invited. We're going to be having Nikki King as a guest on Friday.
Oh, awesome.
That program. So you're completely invited if
Cool.
you want to hear what she has to say. But basically, what CADS is it brings together, both kind of frontline rehabilitation services, but also more of a community services coordinated through the court system. Things like group therapy, vocational training, mindfulness, meditation training, are those types of integrated programs that have not just an individual element, but a community element. In your view, is that more the way forward?
Of course, yeah. So going back to those three tiers again, right? So we know the power of conditioning. The more you repeat something, the more that dopamine gets released in response to those cues. So, uh, a bunch of ice cubes in a glass will trigger dopamine in an alcoholic to incessantly pursue that drink. So that is almost impossible to stop. There's even been experiments with monkeys or I think this one was actually with mice, where an electric shock, once cued with dopamine, wouldn't prevent a mouse from getting I think they were primed with Cheerios and Fruit Loops, which was the interesting thing. And so it's so powerful, right? So when you look at policies and programs, rehab centers, the traditional, get them out of their environment, put them in a place, don't allow them to have drugs, that actually works because the dopamine signals they aren't being stimulated. They aren't actually getting the reward once stimulated. So they work until you put them back in the environment, right? So until they're isolated again, until they're worried about how they're going to pay their bills, until they're maybe they talk to their dad and they remember, getting hit by him all the time, or maybe their relationship is highly stressful. They're going to go back to their old mechanisms that reduce that stress. So when you look at programs, we have a lot in the downtown east side of Vancouver that are culturally appropriate. So it's, arts programs. It's we have a lot of Vancouver's very special in our treatment. We have a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy programs. Not everything's free, obviously, and hard to access. If you can prove you have suffered from addiction, you have more likelihood to get into these programs. Of course, you always need more resources, which is tough. But yeah, community-based programs and belonging-based programs where everyone goes, oh, you experienced that too? Okay, I thought I was the only one, or I was told I was wrong, or there was something, bad about me inherently. But it seems to be that, you can see other people who've gone through the same thing. So that reduces the stress and that reduces kind of all the fear and anxiety based around what they have gone through. So yeah, to me, it shows you can do fMRI scans in the brain and see those reward centers light up just by. There was a quilting program actually in the downtown east side where a woman from the fancy neighborhood Westban, who was kind of isolated, it's a very wealthy neighborhood in Vancouver, was making quilts with a woman who lived on the downtown east side and had a heroin addiction, and they were talking and they connected and they both were like, oh, my grandma used to knit or quilt or whatever it was. So those programs are hopeful, and there's a lot of argument based on whether it's you should use just those. There are other, there's naloxone, naltrexone, there's drugs that actually can block the receptors for certain drugs so that if they do fall back into their old habits, they don't get as big of a boost of a reward. So programs that are social based paired with kind of these medications that help reduce the experience of drugs or the drive towards there's dopamine blocker drugs too. So naltrexone, basically you're cued, you obtain the alcohol, but you don't get the same reward. So that placed alongside of therapy is community-based therapy is kind of the strongest way forward that we're seeing.
So last question I'm going to ask you. I would imagine a number of students read this piece and said, this is exactly the kind of work I would love to do myself. And one of the things I think you do very, very well as a journalist is you write about the psychology and the science in a very approachable and accessible way.
Thank
And
you.
from what I know, your formal training is in politics and history. You don't have formal training in something like psychology. And now you're
Yeah.
a neuroscience writer and a very good one. So can you talk about kind of the process of getting there? And I guess you're kind of learning by doing education and some of the more scientific dimensions of what you study and what you research and report on.
Yeah, that's a great question because I used to be very timid to speak to a neuroscientist or, someone who'd done really phenomenal research or a famous author who's been writing about these subjects. I think the thing that makes explanatory journalism, which is what this piece is called, powerful is when you actually aren't an expert. So you're not using the jargon. I mean, I'm sure I have in this whole talk, dopamine and receptors and all of that. But when you go from, hey, what's going on here? You ask the questions that the reader will have as well. And you go, okay, what does that mean? You can talk about D1 and D2 receptors and all of these different types of dopamine, but you do kind of in that way get to, I don't want to say dumb it down, but get to simplify it. So I think it does help to come from kind of a lay person's experience. And yeah, I mean, I think if anybody's interested in doing this, if you're curious, if you have questions and you get one answer and it's not enough, and you want to ask more and find more. And I mean, people love to speak about what they do. So you'll find that researchers, profs, authors, even filmmakers who are covering the topics you're interested in are just so keen to explain what they've learned. And so it's not something that only someone with a PhD can do. I think that's the great thing about journalism, is that you do get to cover all of the different subject areas that you're interested in. But yeah, if you want to do it, we have email. You can just email profs and say, hey, do you want to chat? And especially now that we have Zoom, you can chat over Zoom. So if you want to do it, it's highly rewarding. And yeah, it's definitely something I would recommend.
Yeah, the time is now. Everyone is bored to tears and housebound because of COVID. Like, I noticed that just getting people to talk for or to come in as guest speakers for this class.
Yeah,
So would you mind taking a few questions for my students if they have any?
of course not. Yeah, I'd love to.
So I'll have you guys raise your hands if you have a question. So Nathan asks, yeah, I'm not doctor. I'm more of a blue cheese dressing guy, by the way. I'm not a ranch dressing guy, but I did ask, how do you think the opioid epidemic in the United States would look were medical marijuana earlier in the game a legal alternative to something like OxyContin? So if people in kind of the 90s, early part of the 2000s had more access to using medicinal marijuana for pain relief, for the purpose of pain management, would
Yeah.
the opioid crisis in the United States look different today? Very good question.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, and anyone who's read about Purdue and the Sacklers will know that there was a lot of marketing and a lot of, so much money being pumped into pushing these when they weren't necessary. They're definitely necessary. There's a great piece by Maya Salovitz in the Columbia Journalism Review about this narrative that, you know, Purdue was the only reason for the epidemic. So we have to definitely make sure that that distinction, wasn't just caused by Purdue. They were bad and they did bad things, but it was caused by other elements too. But I think, to me, it's obvious. You look at the science. I think I have it written down here. I'm going to say it wrong, but anandamide is the component that we naturally produce, that we have receptors for, that cannabidol, so THC, binds to. So that it actually, we have this natural pain reducer and stress reliever that we produce, but that THC can also imitate. So there's a lot of work around marijuana. I think a huge thing too is that you never want to just say that, okay, this external substance is going to be the only thing that's going to be the answer. Because I have spoken to people who they have, you know, if addiction is defined as compulsive use despite consequences, they say, yes, I have problems with marijuana, I can't not smoke it. So there are those risks, but I absolutely do agree with the question that it would have prevented a lot of people from going on opioids and repeating the use of those opioids. So that, you know, that definitely pushes them towards addiction. And I think that it would have for sure been um, prevented. Yeah. So I hope that I see a lot of states are legalizing. And so that frees up, you need to do a lot of research too, right? So it frees up the ability to do research on marijuana when it's not, you know, you're not being persecuted for, for having it. So yeah, no, that's a great question. It's absolutely true.
That reminds me of a question that I meant to ask you, but I forgot to. Where, in your view, does a habit become an addiction? What's a meaningful distinction between those
Mhm.
terms?
Yeah, so habit's interesting because habit is, you know, something like, you know, if you're a smoker and you're chatting and you just kind of, you know, habitually light up a cigarette and you don't really realize it, right? So you're smoking and, oh, I forgot that I lit that. So habit's kind of this unconscious behavior that you're doing as you, or you're eating chips, you know, you're eating chips and typing, which is, you know, something, or watching movies, right? And you just naturally go and you open this. So it's something that is happening. So Daniel Kahneman wrote a phenomenal book about all of this called Thinking Fast and Slow. And so there's system one and system two. So system one is you're consciously, you know, you're let's say you're new to Zoom, you're going, okay, where do I go on Zoom to get onto here? But then once it gets to system two, so that's the habit, that's where you're just automatically, okay, I'm on and I know exactly. So driving, right? That's a good one too. Pressing, you know, the brake pedal and then pressing the gas when you're 16 is what's going on. But once you know you're 34, you're pressing you don't think about it, right? It's just you see red and you know to slam on the brake, but it's not in your prefrontal cortex, it's more in your limbic system. So
Yeah.
habit is interesting, it's kind of subconscious, but where it becomes addiction is where now it has compulsion, right? So compulsion is a behavior that you engage in despite the consequences. So I don't want to open that next bag of chips, but I'm going to because you know, compulsion, dopamine is driving me towards opening that bag of chips. And so even though your prefrontal cortex is saying, hey, don't do that, you know, whether it's you know, I can't eat that much more salt or I'm trying to lose weight or whatever it is, you're still going to engage in it because of the compulsion factor. So the process of switching between the two is just repeated use and again these factors like stress, so chronic stress and yeah, being needing that release, that reward, that the feel good kind of the endogenous morphine, the endorphins. So it's definitely affected by your environment.
So any more questions for Tracy? Please don't be shy. She's Canadian. She's very nice. We're very nice people. Maddie?
And no question is wrong or stupid or, you know, I could have said a bunch of things that don't make sense. I can clarify any of that too.
Well, you're living proof. Just ask, right? I mean, you had a just ask philosophy and you ended up with this amazing article. So that's probably the one thing you should take out of this talk is just ask. Maddie?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's helpful also for school too, right? Is just I think when you're very young and you don't really you're shy. I've been shy my whole life. You know, if you're shy, that's the one thing is people love to talk about what they know. So always ask. And that's just yeah,
She's
it's a
lying.
great
She was so popular in high school. But anyway, it's neither here nor there.
not true.
Maddie, we'll go to you.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you so much for coming, Tracy. It's been really nice to hear from you, and get kind of this other side of the lecture that we were talking about earlier. I was just wondering, I have two questions. Like, have you experienced any like barriers to your journalism on this topic, whether it be like political or like from like, I don't know, maybe the medical industry? Like, is there anyone kind of like pushing back against what you're saying, either in Canada or other places, or is it more kind of like a welcomed, like understanding piece?
Those are great questions. in Canada, especially Vancouver, we're really lucky. The kind of the consensus in our community that's addressing addiction is absolutely that, we've got these MDs, we've got this research. It's, it's very apparent. The medical establishment one is interesting because there are effective, I mean, you have MAT, which is medication assisted therapy. So that's naltrexone, which is a dopamine blocker, in combination with CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy. So those are very much endorsed by our Canadian medical system. There are private organizations that do offer it too all over the US, MAT. And then there's IOAT, which is injectable opioid agonist treatment. So you're looking at things that are, this is probably complicated, but agonists, full agonists and partial agonists, which basically are just substances that attach or partially attach onto the receptors for drugs that make the experience of the reward less or blocked fully. So those are medical, I don't want to say inventions, that's the wrong word, but you get my point. So when people are looking at kind of the answers to these, it's known and accepted because of the research that's just kind of come out in the last 10 years that childhood trauma and all of these things, social and economic exclusion, as Nikki Haley will actually say when she comes to speak to you guys. But at the beginning there definitely was. It was, no, this is genetic. Everybody stop talking because we need to give you this one drug and this is genetic. And they always want to take the brain out of its environment, look at the brain and go, this is what's going on here. So, this is all we need to address. We don't need to address where the brain is, which is in the body, which is in an environment, right? So there are those people who still exist. They just want to look at, chemical hooks and neuroactivity, and they don't want to talk about what happens to the individual, getting them to the point. So those do exist for sure. Luckily for me, I haven't really experienced any, barriers because my editors are so phenomenal. They gave me the freedom to write this, so I was lucky. There are bigger publications. I've pitched pieces on addiction and gotten rejected because people just, it's too vague, it's too big of a topic, there isn't enough of a character arc or a draw. Journalists really love stories and adventures and kind of those things. So yeah, not so much anymore by the medical establishment, but there definitely used to be. And then with journalism, editors will publish what they want to do, and some won't, some will. So yeah.
Well, George Morehoff in the chat asks, do you think traditional, I guess, abstinence-based kind of 12-step programs like Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous place too much blame on the addict themselves? Maybe the social-based programs you spoke of could provide more of a mindful or healing-based approach?
Mm-hmm. Great question, because mindfulness is being put into these or built into treatment options. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, meditation-based therapies, those are great. The thing that's interesting with Alcoholics Anonymous is that it is still successful. It's and I think the reason is because of that. There is the community element, but the big criticism of that is it's quite religious in its way of saying, you're wrong, you're bad, you can't do that, you're powerless, you have to give up power. So those can deter a lot of people and push them away, or make them feel even worse and more stressed and more likely to reach out to drugs. So I don't want to criticize a program that has worked for millions of people. It definitely has. It's less science-based, but I think that the key component of why it's successful is the community, right? So they have to speak to their sponsors, and they have to check in. And I think that, human connection, it releases endorphins, oxytocin, all of that. So that, reduces the stress that propels people towards needing that relief and that soothing. So the program's not the most scientific, but it's definitely for the people it helps. Yeah, great question though.
So I think we'll have to leave it at that. So the way it works in this structure is it's a 3-hour block of time I fill up every day. I've been doing kind of double header lectures, an hour and a half for one group and an hour and a half for another. So we will have to leave the interview at that. But I'm extending an
great.
standing invitation. We would love to have you down to Kentucky to do a convocation, some type of talk on your research. Anytime you want, we would love to have you down here. I'm sure my students
Love
want
to.
to see you. I'm so thrilled. I was able to assign your article again. A terrific example of what you can do by just asking.
Mm-hmm.
Tracy starts with zero formal training in psychology. I'd say it, but you're sounding a lot like an expert now. You threw out a ton of jargon.
Yeah, the more and more is coming. So there's a lot of there's so much to say and discover and all of that. So I really appreciate it. You guys are all, great questions, and I'm sure you're gonna love this semester, this class on the appellation.
Yeah, and you're welcome to come. We'll have Nikki King. I think she's coming at 1:30 my time on Friday.
Friday.
Yeah,
Great.
so you're welcome back then.
Send you an email. That's wonderful. I'd love to. She's doing great work too. So, you guys are lucky. That'll be fun. Really fun.
Thank you so
Cool.
much for your time.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye bye.